Sarah Martinez had grease under her fingernails and motor oil stains on her uniform when the alarm bells started screaming across the forward operating base. She was lying flat on her back under a Humvee, wrench in hand, trying to fix a transmission that had been giving the mechanics trouble for 3 days straight. The vehicle was scheduled to roll out with SEAL Team Alpha in less than 2 hours for what intelligence had labeled a high-priority extraction mission. At 26, Sarah had been working as a motor transport mechanic for the Navy for 8 years. She had joined straight out of high school from a small town in Texas, where her father ran an auto repair shop, and her mother worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Growing up, Sarah had spent more time in her father's garage than most kids spent playing video games. She could rebuild an engine before she could legally drive, and by the time she graduated, she knew more about mechanical systems than most certified technicians. The military had been a natural fit. Sarah wanted to see the world beyond the dusty streets of her hometown, and the Navy offered her the chance to work with some of the most advanced vehicles and equipment in the world. After completing her mechanical training, she had been stationed at various bases across the globe, but this deployment to Afghanistan was her first time working directly with special operations units. The SEALs treated her with respect, which wasn't always the case with regular infantry units. They understood that their lives often depended on the reliability of their vehicles, and Sarah had quickly earned a reputation for being able to fix anything with wheels, tracks, or rotors. She had worked 18-hour days to keep their fleet operational, often sleeping in the motor pool to be available for emergency repairs. When the alarm sounded that morning, Sarah knew it meant trouble. She rolled out from under the Humvee and grabbed her rifle, which she always kept within arm's reach. The base had been hit by mortar attacks twice in the past month, and everyone had learned to respond quickly to any alarm. She ran toward the command center, her boots slipping slightly on the concrete floor still wet from the morning cleaning. Commander Jackson was standing over a radio operator, his face grim as he listened to the crackling voice coming through the speakers. Sarah recognized the voice as Lieutenant Rodriguez, the team leader of SEAL Team Alpha. They were supposed to be on a routine patrol, checking on local village leaders and gathering intelligence about Taliban movements in the area. The radio crackled with static. Then Rodriguez's voice came through again, strained and urgent. His team had been ambushed while investigating reports of a kidnapped aid worker. They were pinned down in a compound about 15 miles from the base, taking heavy fire from at least 30 insurgents who had surrounded their position. The extraction helicopter couldn't get close enough to pull them out because of the intense ground fire, and the nearest ground support was more than an hour away. Sarah listened as the commander tried to coordinate a rescue mission, but every option seemed blocked. The quick reaction force was already deployed on another mission. The available helicopters were either undergoing maintenance or too far away to provide immediate support. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and from the sound of the radio chatter, the SEALs were running low on ammunition. That's when Sarah noticed something that everyone else had missed. On the vehicle status board, the Humvee she had been working on was listed as operational. She had just finished the transmission repair, and while it hadn't been fully tested, she was confident it would run. More importantly, it was the only up-armored vehicle currently available on the base that could potentially make the trip to the ambush site and back. She approached Commander Jackson during a brief pause in the radio traffic. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was steady when she spoke. The commander looked at her with surprise when she volunteered to drive the rescue vehicle to the ambush site. He reminded her that she was a mechanic, not a combat soldier, and that the mission would be extremely dangerous. Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that the SEALs didn't have time to wait for proper reinforcements. She had trained with weapons just like every other sailor, and she had spent enough time around special operations units to understand basic tactics. More importantly, she knew that Humvee better than anyone else on the base. If something went wrong mechanically during the mission, she would be the only one who could fix it in the field. The commander was reluctant, but the radio chatter from the ambush site was becoming more desperate. Lieutenant Rodriguez reported that they had casualties and were running critically low on ammunition. The insurgents were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before the SEALs' position was overrun. With no other options available, the commander finally agreed to let Sarah attempt the rescue mission. She had 30 minutes to prepare. Sarah grabbed extra ammunition for her rifle and sidearm, along with a first aid kit and her basic toolkit in case the vehicle broke down during the mission. She also took night vision goggles and a radio to maintain communication with the base. The plan was simple: drive to the ambush site as quickly as possible, provide covering fire to help the SEALs break contact, and then transport them back to the base. As Sarah performed a final check on the Humvee, several other personnel on the base approached her. Some offered words of encouragement, while others questioned whether she really understood what she was getting into. A few suggested that they should wait for proper reinforcements, even if it meant the SEALs had to hold out longer. Sarah appreciated their concern, but she knew that waiting wasn't an option. The vehicle started on the first try, and Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction despite the circumstances. The transmission was working smoothly, and all the other systems were operating normally. She had done her job well, and now that vehicle might be the key to saving the lives of 8 highly trained special operations soldiers who were trapped 15 miles away. Commander Jackson gave her final instructions over the radio as she prepared to leave the base. She was to proceed directly to the coordinates where the SEALs were pinned down, assess the situation, and provide whatever support she could. If the situation looked too dangerous or if the vehicle was damaged, she was to return to base immediately. Under no circumstances was she to take unnecessary risks or attempt to be a hero. Sarah understood the orders, but as she drove through the base gates and onto the rough desert road, she knew that the situation was likely to require her to make split-second decisions that no amount of planning could prepare her for. The lives of 8 SEALs were depending on her ability to not only reach them, but also help them fight their way out of what sounded like an increasingly desperate situation. The sun was beginning to set as she drove across the harsh Afghan landscape, the Humvee's engine running smoothly despite the rough terrain. Sarah had never been in direct combat before, but she felt strangely calm as she approached what would become the most important mission of her military career. She had no way of knowing that in the next few hours she would be forced to become something she had never trained to be: a warrior. The 15-mile drive to the ambush site took Sarah through some of the most treacherous terrain in the region. The road, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than a dirt track that wound through rocky hills and dried-out creek beds. The Humvee bounced and lurched over obstacles that would have stopped most civilian vehicles, but the heavy-duty suspension and reinforced chassis handled the punishment exactly as they were designed to do. Sarah maintained radio contact with both the base and the trapped SEAL team as she drove. The news from the ambush site was getting worse by the minute. Lieutenant Rodriguez reported that Petty Officer Thompson had taken a bullet to the shoulder and was losing blood fast. Their ammunition was down to less than 2 magazines per man, and the insurgents had brought up what sounded like a heavy machine gun that was systematically destroying their cover. The compound where the SEALs were trapped was an abandoned farm complex surrounded by low stone walls. Intelligence reports indicated that it had once been used as a Taliban staging area, which explained why the insurgents knew the layout so well. They had positioned themselves in a nearly perfect circle around the compound, using the surrounding hills and rock formations to maintain overlapping fields of fire while staying hidden from aerial surveillance. As Sarah approached the area, she could hear the sound of gunfire echoing across the desert. She stopped the Humvee about half a mile from the compound and used her binoculars to survey the situation. What she saw made her stomach tighten with fear and determination. Muzzle flashes were visible from at least a dozen positions around the compound, and she could see the insurgents moving between covered positions as they tried to get closer to the building where the SEALs had taken shelter. The original plan had been for Sarah to simply provide transportation and perhaps some covering fire while the SEALs fought their way to the vehicle. But as she studied the tactical situation, she realized that plan wasn't going to work. The insurgents had positioned themselves too well, and the SEALs were too far from any viable extraction point. If she simply drove up to the compound, both she and the vehicle would be destroyed before she could help anyone. Sarah spent precious minutes studying the terrain and the enemy positions, trying to come up with an alternative approach. Her mechanical mind, trained to solve complex problems under pressure, began to see possibilities that a traditional infantry soldier might have missed. The insurgents had positioned themselves to defend against a direct assault or an aerial extraction, but they hadn't anticipated someone approaching the problem from a completely different angle. She noticed that there was a deep ravine that ran along the eastern side of the compound. The insurgents had ignored it because it appeared to lead away from their target, but Sarah could see that it actually curved back around and would allow her to approach the compound from an unexpected direction. More importantly, the ravine was deep enough to provide cover for the Humvee until she was almost on top of the insurgent positions. Making a decision that would have terrified her if she had stopped to think about it, Sarah radioed her new plan to Lieutenant Rodriguez. Instead of attempting a conventional rescue, she was going to use the Humvee as a weapon. She would drive through the ravine and then burst out directly behind the main insurgent position, using the vehicle's mounted machine gun to break up their formation and create enough confusion for the SEALs to fight their way out. Rodriguez tried to talk her out of it, pointing out that she would be outnumbered by at least 6-1 and that she had no backup if things went wrong. But Sarah had already made up her mind. She could hear the desperation in his voice as he described their situation, and she knew that conventional tactics weren't going to save them. The drive through the ravine was like navigating a nightmare obstacle course. The bottom was filled with loose rocks and debris that threatened to damage the vehicle's undercarriage, while the narrow walls scraped against the Humvee's armor plating. Sarah had to use all her mechanical knowledge to keep the engine from overheating and the transmission from seizing up as she pushed the vehicle through terrain it was never designed to handle. When she finally reached the point where the ravine curved back toward the compound, Sarah stopped and prepared for what she knew would be the most dangerous few minutes of her life. She checked her weapons one more time, made sure the radio was set to the right frequency, and said a quick prayer that her father had taught her as a child. Then she put the Humvee in gear and drove toward what would become legend. The insurgents never saw her coming. Sarah burst out of the ravine at full speed, the Humvee's engine roaring as she drove directly toward the largest concentration of enemy fighters. She had the element of surprise for perhaps 10 seconds, but she made those seconds count. Using the vehicle's mounted .50 caliber machine gun, she opened fire on the insurgent positions before they could react. The effect was devastating. The insurgents had been focused entirely on the compound where the SEALs were trapped, and they had no prepared positions to deal with an attack from their rear. Several fighters were caught in the open, trying to move to new positions, and they were cut down before they could find cover. The others scattered in confusion, their carefully coordinated assault falling apart in the face of this unexpected threat. But Sarah's advantage lasted only as long as it took the insurgents to realize what was happening. Within moments, dozens of rifles were turning in her direction, and bullets began striking the Humvee's armored hull like deadly hail. Sarah kept the vehicle moving, using her knowledge of mechanical systems to push the engine beyond its normal limits while using the machine gun to keep the insurgents from regrouping. The noise was incredible. The sound of bullets striking armor mixed with the roar of the engine and the heavy thump of the .50 caliber gun created a chaos that threatened to overwhelm her senses. Sarah had trained with weapons, but she had never experienced anything like the intensity of actual combat. Her ears were ringing, her heart was pounding, and every instinct told her to find cover and hide. Instead, she kept fighting. Years of working with complex machinery under pressure had taught her to stay calm and focused, even when everything around her was falling apart. She treated the battle like a particularly challenging mechanical problem, breaking it down into smaller components that she could deal with one at a time. First, eliminate the machine gun position that was threatening the SEALs. Then, disrupt the fighters trying to flank the compound. Finally, create an opening for the SEALs to move. Lieutenant Rodriguez and his team recognized the opportunity immediately. As the insurgents turned to deal with Sarah's assault, the pressure on their position decreased enough for them to go on the offensive. The SEALs burst out of the compound, their rifles blazing as they attacked the confused and scattered insurgent positions from a completely different direction. The battle that followed was unlike anything that Sarah had imagined when she volunteered for the mission. What was supposed to be a simple rescue operation had turned into a complex firefight with multiple moving parts and split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Sarah found herself not just driving and shooting, but coordinating with the SEALs over the radio and adapting her tactics in real time as the situation evolved. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and darkness began to fall over the battlefield, Sarah realized that the fight was far from over. The insurgents were regrouping, and she could see reinforcements arriving from the surrounding hills. What had started as a rescue mission was about to become something much more dangerous, a running battle across 15 miles of hostile territory with enemy fighters converging from all directions. The firefight that erupted in the darkness was unlike anything described in military training manuals. Sarah found herself in the middle of a chaotic running battle where the normal rules of engagement seemed to dissolve into pure survival instinct. The insurgents, realizing that their ambush had failed, were now fighting desperately to prevent their prey from escaping, while more fighters poured in from the surrounding mountains to reinforce their positions. Lieutenant Rodriguez and his team had managed to link up with Sarah's position, but their situation remained critical. Petty Officer Thompson's shoulder wound was bleeding badly, and 2 other SEALs had taken shrapnel from grenades that the insurgents were now throwing with increasing frequency. The team's medic was doing what he could, but they needed to reach proper medical facilities quickly or risk losing Thompson to blood loss. Sarah had become the de facto commander of the combined force, not through any formal authority, but because she was the only one who really understood the capabilities and limitations of their primary asset, the armored Humvee. The vehicle had taken dozens of hits, but the armor was holding, and more importantly, the engine was still running smoothly despite the punishment it had endured during the drive through the ravine. The SEALs were amazed by Sarah's transformation from mechanic to warrior. She was making tactical decisions with the same methodical approach she used to diagnose engine problems, breaking down complex situations into manageable components and finding solutions that none of them had considered. When the insurgents tried to block their escape route with a disabled truck, Sarah identified an alternate path through a dried-out irrigation canal that would have been invisible to someone without her eye for mechanical details. But the insurgents weren't giving up. As the mixed force began fighting its way back toward the base, they found themselves facing increasingly desperate attacks. The enemy fighters knew the terrain better than anyone, and they were using that knowledge to set up successive ambush positions along the most likely escape routes. Every few hundred yards, the Humvee and its passengers would come under fire from a new direction, forcing them to fight their way through each obstacle. Sarah's mechanical skills proved just as valuable as her combat abilities during the running battle. When a rocket-propelled grenade damaged the Humvee's left front tire, she managed to keep the vehicle moving by redistributing weight and adjusting the suspension settings. When the radiator took a bullet and began leaking coolant, she rigged a temporary repair using materials from the vehicle's emergency kit and her own ingenuity. The SEALs watched in amazement as Sarah performed these mechanical miracles while simultaneously manning the machine gun and coordinating their movement. She seemed to have developed an almost supernatural awareness of the vehicle's condition, anticipating problems before they became critical and finding solutions that kept them mobile when a breakdown would have meant certain death. The most dangerous moment came when they were still 8 miles from the base. The insurgents had managed to get ahead of them and set up a roadblock using stolen military equipment, including a heavy machine gun that could potentially penetrate the Humvee's armor. The position was too strong to assault directly, and there was no obvious way around it without exposing the vehicle to fire from multiple directions. That's when Sarah remembered something from her mechanical training that proved to be the key to their survival. The Humvee was equipped with a smoke generation system that was supposed to be used for vehicle maintenance, but Sarah realized it could be adapted for tactical purposes. She rigged the system to produce a massive smoke screen that completely obscured the roadblock, then drove straight through the position at full speed while the SEALs engaged targets they could barely see through the artificial fog. The maneuver worked perfectly, but it came at a cost. The Humvee took several more hits during the passage, and one of the bullets damaged the transmission that Sarah had worked so hard to repair earlier that day. She could feel the vehicle beginning to lose power, and she knew they might not make it to the base unless she could find a way to compensate for the mechanical damage. Working entirely by feel and sound, Sarah began manually controlling the transmission while still driving and fighting. She used techniques that would have been impossible for anyone without her deep understanding of mechanical systems, essentially becoming a human computer that could calculate gear ratios and power distribution in real time. The other occupants of the vehicle had no idea what she was doing, but they could tell that her efforts were keeping them moving when the vehicle should have broken down completely. The final 5 miles of the journey were a nightmare of mechanical improvisation and continuous combat. Sarah was simultaneously fighting a running mechanical failure and an increasingly desperate enemy force that seemed determined to destroy them regardless of the cost. She found herself making split-second decisions about everything from engine timing to ammunition conservation, while coordinating with the SEALs to maintain an effective defense against attacks from multiple directions. When they finally reached the outer perimeter of the base, Sarah was running on pure adrenaline and determination. The Humvee was barely functional, held together by her mechanical expertise and sheer willpower. The SEALs were exhausted and wounded but alive. Most importantly, they had accomplished something that military analysts would later describe as impossible. A single mechanic and 8 special operations soldiers had fought their way through more than 50 enemy fighters and survived to tell the story. The base medical team rushed Thompson and the other wounded SEALs to the field hospital, where they made full recoveries. Sarah finally allowed herself to collapse from exhaustion, but not before ensuring that the damaged Humvee was properly secured and that her tools were accounted for. Even in the aftermath of the most intense combat experience of her life, her mechanical instincts remained strong. The after-action report took weeks to complete, partly because the events seemed too extraordinary to believe. Sarah had officially engaged more than 50 enemy fighters during the course of the mission, and intelligence estimates suggested that her actions had eliminated or wounded at least 20 insurgents while rescuing 8 critically trapped SEALs. The mechanical innovations she had developed under fire were studied by military engineers who were amazed by her ability to adapt standard equipment for tactical purposes. Lieutenant Rodriguez recommended Sarah for the Navy Cross, citing her extraordinary courage under fire and her critical role in saving the lives of his entire team. Commander Jackson added his own commendation, noting that Sarah's actions had demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking and personal courage that exemplified the best traditions of military service. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the SEALs themselves, who formally inducted Sarah into their brotherhood and presented her with a special patch that read, "Honorary SEAL, earned in combat." For a mechanic from small-town Texas who had joined the Navy to see the world and work on interesting machines, it was an honor that she never could have imagined when she first enlisted. Sarah continued her military service for several more years, eventually becoming a senior mechanical instructor responsible for training other technicians. She never saw combat again, but her legend grew within the special operations community, where stories of the mechanic who saved SEAL Team Alpha became part of the informal oral history passed down from one generation of warriors to the next. Years later, after retiring from the military and returning to Texas to help run her father's expanded auto repair business, Sarah would occasionally receive visits from former SEALs who wanted to thank her personally for what she had done that night in Afghanistan. She always welcomed them warmly, but she never considered herself a hero. In her mind, she had simply done what needed to be done, using the skills and knowledge that life had given her to solve a problem that happened to involve saving lives rather than fixing engines. The Humvee that carried them through that desperate fight was eventually repaired and returned to service, but it was never quite the same. Mechanics who worked on it reported that it seemed to run more smoothly and reliably than other vehicles in the fleet, as if it had been somehow changed by its experience in combat. Sarah smiled whenever she heard those stories, knowing that machines, like people, could sometimes surprise you with what they were capable of when the situation demanded it.